was Barack Obama in the last debate. His comment within that quote, he said, 40 years ago when I was 8 years old, he engaged in despicable acts with a radical domestic group. I have roundly condemned those acts. Your thoughts on that, Bill?
Well, we were a radical domestic group, and he did condemn those acts. I don't think that what we did was exactly, it certainly wasn't perfect, and it wasn't something that I've defended in every way. But on the other hand, I don't expect somebody to today endorse what we did 40 years ago or even to understand it. That, to me, nothing that he said is either, false or wrong or terrible. The other thing I guess I would say about it is we would disagree on our evaluation of what went on 40 years ago, but we disagree on many things, so it's not surprising.
Like what do you disagree with?
Well, I would say calling those acts despicable 40 years ago, I guess I would disagree with. But more to the point is that it's an irrelevant issue in this campaign. And what's interesting is that it was raised up in an attempt to replay the culture wars. There was this wonderful moment on Stephen Colbert where the word for the night was the 60s. And he has a clip of Obama saying, can't we just leave the 60s behind? And it comes back to Colbert in full anger saying, no, Senator, we can't leave it behind. It's the gift that keeps on giving. And frankly, I think the fact that this may be the last time that the 60s is raised in that kind of cultural warriors way is a mixed blessing. On the one hand, I think it is time to move on, and there's a new generation, and a lot of the nostalgia for the 60s, both the hatred of it and the love of it, is misplaced. I think it's time to look forward. On the other hand, I think that it's a sad thing that we've never really had a truth and reconciliation process about the war in Vietnam, about the Black Freedom Movement and what happened. And that means, among other things, that we haven't learned the lessons of invasion and occupation. We haven't learned the lessons of what happens when people get involved in direct action and struggle, and both the advances that can be made and also the limits of those struggles. We haven't learned the lessons that might make for a more peaceful, more just future. I think that's the problem.
Bernardine, I wanted to stay there for a minute, and then, Bernardine, I wanted to get your response with this clip actually focusing on you. And this is that film that came out a few years ago called Weather Underground. It perhaps gives some context to this. It begins with, well, the Black Panther who was killed soon after this, Fred Hampton.
So we always say in the Black Panther Party that they can do anything they want to us. We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary.
In Chicago today, 2 Black Panthers were killed as police raided a Panther stronghold.
Police arrived at Fred Hampton's West Side apartment at 4:45 this morning. They had a search warrant authorizing them to look for illegal weapons. The state's attorney's office says that Hampton and another man were killed in the 15-minute gun battle which followed.
The pigs murdered Deputy Chairman Fred Hampton while he lay in bed. Their lies, their arguing to the people can't bear up to the evidence that we have that they murdered our Deputy Chairman in cold blood as he lay in his bed asleep.
The Panther Party organized tours of the apartment that they were in when they were murdered. And I went with a group of people from the SDS National Office, which is a couple of blocks away.
Don't touch nothing, don't move nothing, we want to keep everything just the way it is.
It was a scene of carnage. It was a scene of war. You see this door ridden with bullets, not little bullet holes, but shattered.
The room where the first brother Mark Clark was murdered at.
You walk through a living room into the bedroom, and there's a mattress soaked in his blood, red blood down the floor.
Anyone who went through that apartment and examined the evidence that was remaining there could come to only one conclusion, and that is that Fred Hampton, 21 years old and a member of a militant, well-known militant group, was murdered in his bed, probably as he lay asleep.
This blatant act of legitimatized murder strips all credibility from law enforcement. In the context of other acts against militant blacks in recent months, it suggests an official policy of systematic repression.
We felt that the murder of Fred required us to be more grave, more serious, more determined to raise the stakes and not just be the white people who wrung their hands when black people were being murdered.
It's 2.5 weeks since Fred Hampton was murdered by the pigs who own this city, and for people to be able to enjoy Christmas time in this country without remembering and without making a choice about the struggle that's going on in the world, without taking action about a blatant murder that takes place in the city against a revolutionary black leader, is an obscenity.
That was Bernardine Dohrn in 1969, just after Fred Hampton was killed. And this is from the documentary The Weather Underground by Sam Green and Bill Siegel. Bernardine Dohrn, take us back then and continue with the context.
Well, the murder of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, as we now know, is thoroughly documented and decided by courts, federal courts here in Chicago and Illinois, was carried out in a conspiracy, in a secret conspiracy between the FBI and the Chicago Police Department. It was covered up, denied, lies were told, and it was, one of many targeted assassinations of African-American leaders in political life. I think during this election campaign, still the echoes and fears for the safety of African-American political leaders echoed, certainly from people in our generation, because of the traumatic experiences with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King's assassination and so many Panthers targeted and assassinated. The murder of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark certainly galvanized us and threw us into a level of activity and purposefulness, but so did the Vietnam War. And really, one of the extraordinary things was the merger of those two great rivers of struggle. And they were not separate, the Black Freedom Movement and the war in Vietnam eventually. So, you had a situation in that era, almost unimaginable now and rarely remembered, where Dr. King, in one of the great speeches of his life, at Riverside Church in 1967, said, "The greatest purveyor of violence on this earth is my own country." That was a painful and agonizing thing for him to say. He said it against the pressures of people around him, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, the Democratic Party. But he said it because he felt that it was true and that it required a certain kind of action. A year later, he was assassinated and dead. I raise the question when I speak now, is that still true today? Is the greatest purveyor of violence on this earth our own country? Not the only purveyor of violence, but the greatest. If that's true, we felt then, and I still believe, it requires people who are citizens here, who care about the great moral issues of our time, to respond, to not let these crimes and suffering be done in our name. Now, how you respond is a whole other question. And I think, one of the things that's interesting about reviving the 60s by using Bill as a caricature, as a placeholder during this election to try to make the 60s seem dangerous and terrifying, is worth examining. In fact, the 60s was liberatory and exciting and gave birth to a whole progeny of social struggles that transformed American life. Barack Obama could not have been elected president without the great struggles of the civil rights and the Black Freedom Movement, without white people in the United States wrestling with the issue of racism and white supremacy, without the women's movement, without the veterans movement, really, to tell the truth about the Vietnam War and all wars of occupation and conquest, the disabled rights movement, the environmental movement, the green movement, the labor struggles. So these are the part of the 60s that are being pushed aside, disremembered, and an attempt to really rewrite the notion that the issues of our day are defined by what people do.